The apartment was cheap, located in an old, forgotten district where the streetlights always flickered and died. The air inside smelled of stagnant water, dust, and something deeply unsettling, a faint, sweet scent of decay. The landlord, an old man with hollow eyes and hands that never stopped trembling, had given me only one rule before vanishing into the night. Do not touch the walls. Leave the paper alone. But the wallpaper was hideous. It was a thick, damp, rotten fabric covered in faded, twisting floral patterns that looked less like flowers and more like tangled veins. At midnight, the silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from inside the plaster, as if something with blunt claws was trying to count the seconds. Driven by frustration and a growing sense of unease, I grabbed my steel scraper. I approached the corner where the paper was already peeling. The first pull was violent. The paper tore with a loud, wet screech that echoed through the empty apartment like a human cry. I pulled harder, ripping away a massive sheet. Underneath, there was no concrete or drywall. The bare wall was covered in deep, ancient, rhythmic incisions carved into the stone, hundreds of ritual tallies and erratic geometric symbols that seemed to pulse in the dark. The scratching sound inside the wall suddenly stopped, replaced by a low vibrating hum that traveled directly into my bones. The walls were just the outer shell of the trap. The deeper I went into the renovation, the more I realized that the house was active. The parallel wooden floorboards, old and black with age, felt loose and unstable beneath my boots. Every time I stepped near the window, the wood didn't just creak, it sank slightly, as if it were resting on a soft, yielding mass instead of solid beams. My mind was playing tricks on me. I could swear the floor was rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cycle, like a chest breathing in deep sleep. I grabbed my heavy crowbar and jammed it into the gap between two wide planks. The wood splintered with a sharp, agonizing crack that felt dangerously loud in the dead of night. As I pried the first board up, a wave of freezing, stagnant air rushed into my face, carrying the scent of old iron and wet hair. I shone my light into the dark opening. There were no joists, no insulation, no pipes. Below the floorboards lay a deep, absolute black abyss. Resting just inches below the opening was a massive, rusted iron hatch, perfectly circular with concentric rings engraved into its metal surface. It had no handle, no keyhole, only a single deep indentation in the center that looked exactly like the shape of a human palm. The hum from the walls had migrated here, vibrating through the iron hatch, making the air above it shimmer with cold intensity. When my palm touched the cold iron indentation, the lock didn't click, it groaned. The concentric rings spun with a heavy, grinding sound, and the circular hatch slid back into the stone framework, revealing a vertical shaft that dropped down into the unrecorded foundations of the building. I didn't think about the consequences. The mystery had become a physical pull, an invisible rope dragging me down. I climbed into the dark well, my boots finding old rusted iron rungs built into the stone wall. The descent felt endless. The apartment room above shrank into a tiny, distant square of faint light until it vanished completely. I was climbing down through a pure, suffocating vacuum. When my feet finally hit solid ground, I found myself in a vast, impossible subterranean vault. The air here was dead, heavy with the taste of copper and dry earth. I struck a match, and the tiny flame revealed an architecture of madness. Massive stone pillars rose into the dark, but they weren't holding up concrete. They were wrapped in millions of thick, black, vine-like cables and fibrous roots that pulsed with a slow, visceral rhythm. It looked like an organic machine, a giant sleeping loom made of flesh and iron that filled the entire space beneath the city. In the center of the vault sat an ancient, heavy wooden desk, completely untouched by dust, with a single black book lying open on its surface. I approached the desk, my match dying out, leaving me in the cold glow of my mind's panic. I shone my flashlight onto the open pages of the book. The handwriting was frantic, jagged, written in a dark ink that had stained the thick paper like dried blood. It was the journal of the room's previous tenant, dated 40 years ago. As I read the words, the freezing truth began to wrap around my throat. The house is not a structure, the first entry read. It is a trap, a living device designed to attract those who want to disappear. Those who seek isolation. The landlord doesn't collect rent, he collects templates. The journal detailed how the walls would slowly consume the identity of the person inside, tracking their movements through the floorboards, recording their breathing through the plaster, converting their life into geometric data to feed the machine below. The final pages were chaotic, filled with recursive drawings of screaming faces melting into patterns of wallpaper and wires. The last sentence was written over and over again, covering the entire page until it became a solid mass of black ink. The renovation is not yours. You are not fixing the room is resetting you. I looked up from the book, and the silence of the vault was broken by a sound from above. The sharp, heavy slam of the iron hatch closing shut. The trap was complete. I ran to the shaft, scrambling up the iron rungs in pitch-black darkness, my fingers bleeding as I tore at the metal. I reached the top and smashed my fists against the iron hatch. It was solid, immovable, fused into the stone like part of the earth itself. There was no escape. I dropped back down into the vault, my flashlight dying completely, leaving me in the absolute crushing darkness. But I wasn't blind anymore. My hyper-hearing, amplified by the terror, began to translate the architecture. The pulsing of the cables wasn't a random hum, it was a heartbeat. My heartbeat. The machine wasn't crushing me, it was connecting to me. I felt the fine, white filaments of the roots slowly creeping up my boots, tracing the lines of my legs, weaving into my skin without pain, only with a cold, absolute finality. I didn't scream. My voice had been calibrated into the structure. I walked back to the desk, guided by the internal blueprint that was now etched into my brain. I picked up my tools, my hammer and my scraper. I understood my purpose now. I wasn't a tenant, and I wasn't a victim. I was the new operator of the loom. I climbed back up to the apartment, the hatch opening smoothly at my touch. I stood in the stripped room, looked at the bare stone walls, and picked up the scraper. I had to prepare the canvas. The next tenant would arrive soon, and the architecture required new templates.